Donald Trump just made a very bold claim about a giant bridge on the Canadian border. He stood in front of the cameras and he said, plainly, that he beat Canada. He said America had won a much better deal, a tougher deal, a deal that finally put the United States first. And on the surface, it sounded like a clean, simple victory, a win. But then the fine print of that deal started to leak out, one line at a time, and the numbers buried inside it began to tell a completely different story. A story about who actually paid for this bridge, a story about who actually built it, and a story about who quietly walked away with half of the future profits without ever spending a single dollar of their own. Here's the strange part. Both of those things can be true at the very same time. Trump can call it a victory, and the fine print can call it something else entirely, and neither one of them is technically lying. The whole trick is hiding in the details that nobody bothers to read. And that is exactly the kind of story we live for on this channel. So if you love watching a shiny headline fall apart the moment you actually read past it, do me a favor right now and hit that subscribe button for Money Decoded, because that is the entire mission here. We take the deal everyone is celebrating, and we quietly read the page they hope you will skip. Because in finance, in politics, and in your own life, the headline is the marketing, but the fine print is the truth. So let us do this properly. Let us start at the very beginning, with the bridge itself, because you cannot possibly understand who won this deal until you understand what was actually on the table. And what was on the table was one of the most expensive pieces of infrastructure on the entire continent. The bridge at the center of this whole fight is called the Gordie Howe International Bridge. It is a brand new crossing that connects the city of Detroit in Michigan with the city of Windsor just across the water in Ontario, Canada. And it is not a small thing. This is a 6-lane, cable-stayed bridge that stretches roughly 1.5 miles across the Detroit River, one of the busiest trade corridors in all of North America. Now here is the first number that matters, and I want you to hold on to it for the rest of this video, because absolutely everything hinges on it. The bridge cost about $4.7 billion to build, and Canada paid for all of it. Every single dollar. Canada financed the entire project alone. Construction began back in 2018, funded completely, from start to finish, by Canadian taxpayers. The United States did not contribute $1 toward the actual cost of building it. Not one. This was Canada's bridge, on Canada's money, built by thousands of workers, connecting two countries that trade hundreds of billions of dollars across that river every single year. So logically, you would think the country that paid for the entire thing would be the country that controls it and keeps the money it makes. That is how it works when you build something with your own money. And for a while, that is exactly how the deal was written. But then something happened. Because even though the United States never paid a cent toward construction, Trump threatened to block the bridge from opening at all. He demanded compensation. He demanded fairness. And back in February, he went even further and suggested that America deserved to own half of the bridge outright. A bridge it did not pay for. And to understand why that demand was so explosive, you have to understand the original deal that Canada had actually agreed to. Because that original deal was genuinely, honestly, fair. Under the original agreement, the one that stood for years, the arrangement was simple and honestly quite reasonable. Canada had paid the full $4.7 billion to build the bridge, so Canada would keep 100% of the tolls. Every car, every truck, every dollar collected at that bridge would flow straight back to Canada. And that would continue until Canada had fully recovered its $4.7 billion investment. In plain English, Canada gets to make its money back first. That is the whole idea. You spent the money, you took the risk, so you get paid back before anyone else sees a single cent. Only after Canada had recovered every dollar it spent would the profits finally start to be split, 50-50, evenly between the two countries. Now stop and think about how fair that actually is. America pays nothing to build it, and still, under the original deal, America would eventually share in the profits. It just would not happen until Canada was made whole first. That is a remarkably generous arrangement for a country that contributed nothing to construction. But Trump looked at that deal, the one where Canada simply recovers its own costs before splitting the profits, and he called it completely unacceptable. He said it was unfair to the United States, and he demanded that the whole thing be renegotiated, urgently, right now. So to force the issue, he reached for the only piece of leverage he actually had. He could not unbuild the bridge. He could not take back money that America had never spent. But he could do one thing. He could refuse to let the traffic flow. He could keep the finished bridge closed and dangle the opening like a prize. And that is the move that changed everything. The bridge was finished. It was physically complete, standing over the river, connected to the highway systems on both sides, ready to carry traffic tomorrow morning. But a finished bridge that nobody is allowed to cross is worth nothing to anybody. And Trump understood that the single moment of opening, the ribbon cutting, was the exact point where he held maximum leverage. So negotiations began, and the opening was quietly delayed. This is a subtle thing, so let me make it painfully obvious. Michigan residents desperately wanted this bridge open. Businesses on both sides of the river had been waiting for years. Trucking companies were counting on it. And every extra week that the bridge stayed closed was a week of pressure. Not pressure on Trump, but pressure on everyone who needed it to open. That is how leverage really works. You find the thing the other side wants badly, and you calmly stand in front of it. In June, officials postponed the ribbon-cutting ceremony, saying there were still outstanding issues to resolve. Outstanding issues on a bridge that was already completely built and ready to go. But the issues were not concrete, or steel, or safety. The issues were about money and ownership, and who would control the profits for the next 15 years. And then, just a few weeks later, Trump stepped in front of the cameras and announced that he had done it. He had secured a much better deal. He praised the Canadian government. He celebrated the bridge finally opening, now scheduled for July 27th. It sounded like the fight was over, and America had won cleanly. And then people started reading the fine print. And the celebration got very quiet. Here is the number that stopped people cold the moment it finally surfaced. Under this new and improved deal, the one Trump was celebrating, for the next 15 years, Canada keeps only 50% of the profits from the bridge. The other 50% gets funneled into something called a Regional Economic Development Fund. Now let that sink in against everything we already know. Canada, alone, paid the entire $4.7 billion. Under the old deal, Canada would recover every dollar of that before splitting anything. But under this new deal, that full recovery is no longer guaranteed. Right away, half of the profits get diverted somewhere else, into a fund, before Canada has even been made whole. And here is the question that makes financial people deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Who controls that fund? Who manages it? What are its actual rules? What projects does it pay for? And the unsettling answer, at least so far, is that nobody has clearly explained any of it. A fund with no published rules, no named managers, and no obvious owner, quietly collecting half the profits of a bridge that Canada paid for, entirely on its own. That is the fine print. That is the part that was not in the celebration. And this was not some fringe internet rumor, either. A Canadian journalist first surfaced these specific terms directly from officials. Then the Wall Street Journal confirmed the 50-50 profit split. Then Fox Business reported the very same details, citing a senior Canadian official. So this is confirmed from several different directions at once. The country that paid nothing now captures half of the upside. And the country that paid everything gave up its guaranteed recovery. But a deal like this always has a deeper layer. Because whenever money quietly changes direction, the real question is never just what happened. The real question is who benefits. To understand who benefits, you have to zoom out from this one bridge and look at what is sitting right next to it. Because the Gordie Howe Bridge is not the only crossing between Detroit and Windsor. Just a short distance away stands another bridge, an older one, called the Ambassador Bridge. And here's what makes it so interesting. The Ambassador Bridge is not owned by any government. It is privately owned by a single, extremely wealthy American family, the Moran family. For decades, that private bridge has been a money machine, collecting tolls from a huge share of all the trucks and cars crossing between the two countries. Now think about what a brand new, government-backed, modern bridge means to the owners of the old private one. It means competition. A shiny new crossing, right next door, threatens to pull traffic away from their bridge. And every truck that takes the new bridge is a toll that does not land in their pockets. So it should not surprise you at all to learn that, for years, this family fought the Gordie Howe project. They opposed it. They funded legal battles to try to stop it, because it directly threatened their private stream of toll revenue. Now here is where it gets delicate, and I am going to be careful and stick only to what has actually been reported. Reports note that this family has donated money to the Trump administration. Reports also note that they previously supported the former United States ambassador to Canada. And every single extra month that the new bridge stayed closed, delayed, tangled up in negotiation, was another month that traffic kept crossing their private bridge instead. I am not going to tell you what to conclude from that, but I will tell you this. When you are trying to understand any deal, you follow the money, and you always ask a simple question. Who was quietly helped by the delay? Let us stay on that private bridge for a minute, because this is where the story stops being about two countries and starts being about something much older and much more human. Money protecting itself. The Ambassador Bridge has been privately owned for a very long time. and it has made its owners extraordinarily wealthy. So when the plan for a brand new, publicly owned bridge first appeared, the owners of the private one did not exactly welcome it. Why would they? A new crossing is a direct threat to their toll booths. Fewer trucks on your bridge means fewer dollars in your account. And so they did what wealthy interests very often do when a public project threatens their private profits. They fought it. For years. With lawyers, with lawsuits, with every tool available. Now, the new bridge got built anyway. But look closely at what the delay accomplished. Every month the Gordie Howe Bridge sat finished but closed. The traffic had nowhere else to go but the existing crossings, including that private one. In other words, the delay itself, whatever its official reason, quietly protected the revenue of the private bridge. And remember what the reports actually tell us. This family has donated to the very administration that demanded the delay. Now I want to be very precise here, because this part matters. I am not claiming a crime. I am not claiming a secret deal in a back room. What I am pointing at is a pattern, and it is a pattern you will start to see everywhere once you know to look for it. Private interests that sit right next to public infrastructure have a powerful incentive to shape how, and when, that infrastructure actually gets used. In the past, the weapon was a lawsuit. This time, the delay arrived wrapped in a presidential negotiation. Same incentive, different tool. And while all of this was happening in Washington, the people who actually received the bridge, the people of Michigan, were reacting in a way that told its own very quiet story. When the bridge opening was finally confirmed, the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, put out a celebration. But watch what she chose to celebrate, and even more importantly, watch what she left out. She praised the bridge. She said that thousands of Michigan workers had physically built this critical crossing with their own hands. She talked about faster auto production, about lower costs, about better paying jobs for the people of her state. It was warm, and it was proud, and it was entirely focused on workers and the economy. And it never once mentioned Donald Trump. Now think about how strange that is on the surface. Here is a president loudly claiming that he just won a much better deal for America and personally delivered this bridge. And the governor of the very state that received that bridge stands up, thanks the workers, thanks the economy, and pointedly does not thank him. In politics, silence like that is not an accident. Silence is a message. When a politician refuses to hand credit to someone, especially for something popular in their own backyard, they are quietly telling you there is tension underneath the surface that the celebration is trying to cover up. Whitmer's careful, deliberate omission of Trump's name spoke volumes. It suggested that the people closest to this bridge did not see the New Deal in the same triumphant way the White House was describing it. And that gap, the gap between how Washington described the deal and how the people paying attention actually reacted, is the exact thread we are going to keep pulling on. Because underneath this one specific bridge is a much bigger idea about how America now negotiates with the entire world. And it all comes down to one single, brutal word: size. So how exactly do you justify taking half the profit from a bridge you did not pay a single dollar to build? Well, the administration did offer an argument, and it is worth hearing carefully, because once you understand it, you will start to recognize it everywhere. The argument came from the United States Trade Representative, a man named Jameson Greer, and his reasoning came down to one single thing: size. He pointed to the sheer scale of the American economy, which is worth roughly $29 trillion. And he compared it to the Canadian economy, which is worth somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion. America, in other words, is well over 10 times larger. And the logic that follows sounds simple. America is bigger, so America deserves the bigger share. Now on first hearing, that can almost sound reasonable. Of course the giant gets more. But stop and actually hold that logic up to the light, because it does not survive contact with the facts. The size of your economy has absolutely nothing to do with who paid for one specific bridge. Let me give you a picture you will never forget. Imagine your neighbor builds a beautiful new fence entirely on their own property, with their own money, from start to finish. And then you walk over, and you say, well, my house is much bigger than yours, so I deserve to own half of your fence. You would be laughed off the street. And yet, that is the exact shape of this argument. It takes something completely unrelated, the overall size of the economy, and uses it to justify a claim on something specific that you did not build and did not fund. It is not really a principle at all. It is leverage, quietly wearing the costume of an argument. And this is the single most important idea in the entire story, so I want you to really sit with it. This deal was not decided by fairness. It was decided by leverage. Those are two completely different operating systems for how the world actually works, and you need to be able to tell them apart. The first system, the one most of us are taught as children, says something simple. The person who pays for something, who builds it, who takes the risk, is the person who should own the result. That is the fairness system. It feels intuitive and it feels just. But there is a second system running quietly underneath, and it does not care about any of that. The second system says that whoever controls the choke point, at the exact moment it matters most, is the one who gets to rewrite the terms. It does not matter who paid. It does not matter who built it. What matters is who has their hand on the valve when the other side is desperate. And in this story, the finished bridge was the valve, and the opening was the moment. Canada held the deed, but America held the timing. And timing, it turns out, was the stronger card. Now here is why this should matter to you, even if you never cross this bridge in your entire life. Because this exact same logic, leverage over fairness, is now spilling out of this one crossing and into far bigger arenas. It is showing up in trade deals that quietly shape the price of your groceries, the cost of your next car, the price you pay at the gas pump. When leverage becomes the operating principle instead of fairness, the people standing downstream are the ones who quietly pay for it. And nowhere is that shift more visible than in the trade agreement that governs this entire border. Because the rules of that agreement just changed. To see how big this really is, you have to zoom out from the bridge and look at the rulebook that governs all trade across this entire border. For decades, that rulebook was called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Then, during Trump's first term, it was renegotiated and renamed. Today it is called the USMCA, the agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And here is the detail that matters most. This agreement was designed to be reviewed, and Trump declined to simply let it roll forward smoothly. Instead of the long, predictable cycle that businesses had quietly counted on for years, the whole thing is now facing far more frequent, far more uncertain reviews. And I need you to understand why that one change is so quietly powerful. Businesses do not fear bad rules nearly as much as they fear uncertain ones. A company can plan around almost anything, as long as it knows the rules will still be the same in 5 years. But when the rules could shift every single year, real planning becomes almost impossible. And nowhere on earth is that more dangerous than right here at Detroit and Windsor. Because these two cities are not really two separate economies at all. They are one deeply intertwined automotive ecosystem, stitched together across a river. A single car part can cross that border 3 or even 4 times before the vehicle is finished. Raw metal becomes a component on one side, gets assembled further on the other, crosses back for finishing, and on and on. Every one of those crossings depends on stable, predictable rules. So when the rules themselves become uncertain, the cost of that uncertainty gets baked into everything. Into supply chains, into prices, into jobs. A bridge is just steel and cable. But the rules that govern what crosses it, those are the real machine. And Canada, to its credit, seems to have finally understood the danger it is in. In the middle of all this, the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, said something that most politicians would never admit out loud. He acknowledged, in effect, that relying so heavily on a single partner, the United States, had quietly become a genuine weakness for his country. And he signaled that Canada would begin working to diversify, to build stronger trade relationships elsewhere in the world, so that it would never again be this exposed to the decisions of one single neighbor. Now I want you to notice something, because this is not just distant international politics. This is one of the oldest and most important lessons in all of personal finance, playing out on a national stage. Think about it in your own life. If every dollar you earn comes from a single employer, then you do not really have a job. You have a single point of failure. The day that one source changes its mind, your entire world is suddenly at risk, and you have almost no leverage at all, because you have nowhere else to go. It is exactly the same for a business that depends on one giant customer, or an investor who pours everything into one single stock. Concentration always feels efficient, right up until the moment it becomes catastrophic. Diversification is not really about earning more. It is about making sure that no single person, no single partner, and no single choke point can ever hold your entire future hostage. Canada just learned that lesson in front of the whole watching world. And it learned it standing on a bridge that it paid for, but no longer fully controls. But let us come back down to earth for a moment, away from all the politics, because there is a real bridge here, carrying real people. And for them, this story actually has a very different and much more hopeful side. Now, after everything we have pulled apart, I do not want you to walk away thinking this bridge is a bad thing, because it is not. For the ordinary people who will actually drive across it, the Gordie Howe International Bridge is genuinely, undeniably good news. Let me show you why. Before this bridge existed, Almost all of the truck traffic between Detroit and Windsor was funneled across just a handful of aging crossings, and the busiest of them all was that privately owned Ambassador Bridge we talked about earlier. When you push that much of a continent's trade through so few lanes, you get exactly what you would expect. Bottlenecks, delays, trucks idling in long lines, burning fuel, waiting to cross. And every one of those wasted hours is a real cost, one that eventually shows up in the price of the goods that you buy. The Gordie Howe Bridge changes that math. It is a brand new, 6-lane crossing, and it adds something an economy like this one desperately needs. Redundancy, a second modern route, so that all of that traffic is no longer squeezed through a single point. And this is not just a nice feeling, it has actually been measured. A study out of the University of Windsor estimated that the trucking industry alone could save around $2.3 billion over the next 30 years, simply from reduced congestion and faster, more reliable crossings. Think about what that really means on the ground. Faster deliveries, lower shipping costs, auto plants on both sides of the river that can run more smoothly, because the parts they need are not stuck in traffic. This is infrastructure doing exactly what good infrastructure is supposed to do, quietly making everything around it work a little bit better. So the bridge itself, the steel and the cable and the 6 lanes, that part is a real win. But remember, the bridge was never the argument. The argument was always about the fine print. And that fine print still has one enormous, unanswered question sitting right in the middle of it. And that question, the one that simply refuses to go away, is about the fund. Remember it? That Regional Economic Development Fund, the one that quietly swallows half of the bridge's profits for the next 15 years. Now here is what I want you to notice. And it is a contrast so sharp that it should make you sit up. When the University of Windsor wanted to tell us that truckers would save money, they gave us a number, $2.3 billion. And behind that number was a study, a methodology, a source you could actually go and check for yourself. It was specific, it was traceable, it could be questioned, and it could be defended. Now compare that to the fund. How much money will actually flow into it? Unclear. Who controls it? Unclear. What are its rules? Unclear. Who decides which projects it pays for? Unclear. One side of this deal, the benefit to drivers, comes to us in bright, specific, checkable detail. The other side, the destination of half the profits, comes to us wrapped in fog. And whenever you are looking at any deal, in business, in politics, or in your own financial life, that contrast is one of the most important warning signs there is. The parts that someone wants you to feel good about tend to arrive with clear, confident numbers. And the parts that someone would rather you did not examine too closely tend to arrive vague, soft, and undefined. So in the next chapter, we are going to walk right up to that fund, and we're going to look at the exact words the officials used to describe it. Because those words, and what they very carefully avoid saying, tell you almost everything you need to know. So let us walk right up to this fund and put it under the microscope. When officials were asked about how the money would actually be handled, the language that came back from the authority that oversees the bridge was exactly the kind of language that should always make your antenna go up. There was talk of cooperative measures. There was talk of toll governance transparency. Now, say those phrases out loud with me. Cooperative measures, toll governance transparency. They sound responsible. They sound official. They sound like the kind of thing a serious institution says. But here's the problem. When you actually try to grab hold of them, there is nothing solid there. What, specifically, is a cooperative measure? Cooperation between whom? Over what? Decided by which people? Subject to which rules? What does transparency actually mean here when there are no published documents, no named managers, and no public accounting that anybody can point to? This is what I would call the language of reassurance without commitment. It is carefully designed to make you feel that everything is under control without ever actually promising you a single concrete thing. And there is a world of difference between a promise and a guarantee. A guarantee is written down. It is specific. It has real consequences if it is broken. A promise, especially a vague one, is just a feeling wearing a nice suit. Everything we have been told about this fund, so far, lives in the world of the promise, and almost nothing lives in the world of the guarantee. And when we are talking about half the profits of a $4.7 billion bridge, flowing somewhere for 15 straight years, the difference between those two worlds is not small. It could very easily be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Now I can already hear some of you thinking, come on, maybe it is just early. Maybe the details simply have not been published yet. And you know what? That is completely fair. That might be exactly what is happening. I am not going to stand here and tell you that this fund is definitely hiding something sinister, because I genuinely do not know that, and honestly, neither does anyone else outside of those rooms. But here is the lens I want to hand you, because it will serve you well for the rest of your life. When money is involved, vagueness is almost never an accident. Clear terms are not hard to write. If everyone involved wanted you to know exactly how this fund worked, exactly who controlled it, and exactly where the money went, they could tell you in a single afternoon. It is not difficult. So when the details stay foggy, month after month after month, you are allowed to ask a very simple question. Who benefits from the fog? Because clarity has a cost. Clarity means accountability. Clarity means that if the money goes somewhere it should not, everyone can see it happen. And vagueness quietly removes that cost for whoever happens to be on the receiving end. This is true of a national infrastructure fund, and it is just as true of a fine print clause in your own credit card agreement, or the fee structure buried on page 19 of some investment product. The powerful rarely hide things in the dark. They hide them in language so boring and so vague that you give up before you finish reading. Your job, as someone who refuses to be fooled, is to slow down at exactly the place where they are hoping you speed up. And nowhere in this entire story does that matter more than in understanding how a simple bridge opening turned into a full-blown international standoff in the first place. To really understand this deal, you have to understand that the bridge was never fighting its own battle. It got swept up into a much larger storm. Back in February, the tension between the two countries was already running hot, and it was about far more than one crossing. There were complaints about trade. There were grievances about Canada not stocking certain American products, including American alcohol, on its shelves. There were the broader tariff battles and the constant background tension with China rippling through absolutely everything. And then there was a moment that, honestly, tells you just how emotional and how strange this whole thing became. At one point, the friction spilled all the way into hockey, with acclaim floated about the Stanley Cup, of all things. Think about that for a second. A dispute that somehow involved a championship trophy, tangled up with a multi-billion-dollar bridge. That is how far this stopped being about steel and started being about pride and pressure and power. And in the middle of all that noise, the finished bridge just sat there, quiet and complete, becoming the single most convenient pressure point available to anyone who wanted one. Now, this is the part one really want you to hold on to. The mayor of Windsor, a man named Drew Dilkins, was extremely clear about the reality on the ground. He made it plain that the bridge was fully built. It was ready. There was no engineering reason, no safety reason, no construction reason at all that it could not open. In his telling, the delay was not technical. It was political. And that one distinction is the entire game. Because if a finished, safe, ready bridge stays closed, and the reason is not concrete, or steel, or safety, then the closure itself has quietly become a tool. A finished bridge that will not open is not a construction project anymore. It is a bargaining chip. And if you think this fight suddenly appeared in the last year or so, I need you to understand just how old this story really is. Because the battle over this one bridge has been raging, quietly, for the better part of 2 decades. The idea for a new public crossing between Detroit and Windsor has been on the table since the early 2000s. And from very early on, it faced fierce, organized opposition. Remember that privately owned bridge and the wealthy family behind it? For years, that opposition fought this project through every legal channel available, with lawsuits and challenges designed to slow it down, tie it up, and, if at all possible, stop it entirely. Because a new public bridge threatened a private stream of toll revenue that had been flowing for generations. That is not speculation. That is the documented history of this crossing. Now here is a detail that ties this entire story together, and it is the real reason Canada ended up holding the whole bill. For a very long time, the funding on the American side was uncertain. The money that might have come to help build this bridge never reliably materialized. And so Canada made a decision. Rather than let the project die in the endless fog of who would pay for what, Canada stepped up and financed the entire thing itself, all $4.7 billion, and construction finally began in 2018. Now sit with the irony of that for just a second. The United States did not put up the money to build it. The funding never came. Canada paid for everything precisely because America did not. And then, once the bridge was finished, standing there complete because of Canadian money, the demand arrived that America should own half of it and collect half of its profits. The country that declined to pay, now asking for half. Once you see the full timeline laid out like this, the deal stops looking like a negotiation and starts looking like something else entirely. Now let us do the thing this whole channel exists to do. Let us translate this deal out of political language and into plain dollars, because that is where the truth always hides. Under the original deal, Canada would recover every single dollar of its $4.7 billion investment first, before anyone split even 1 cent of profit. That is clean. You spent the money, you get it back, and then we share whatever is left. But under the New Deal, that guaranteed, first-in-line recovery is gone. Now, half of the profit gets diverted into that fund immediately, before Canada has been made whole. So think carefully about what that actually does to the money. Every dollar of profit that gets pulled away into the fund is a dollar that is not going toward paying Canada back, which means Canada now waits longer, potentially years longer, to recover its own investment. And here is the concept I really want to leave you with, because once you see it, you will start to see it in 100 different places. When you force someone to wait longer to get their own money back, while that money is out there working for somebody else in the meantime, you have effectively given yourself a loan, an interest-free loan, and in this case, an involuntary one. Nobody used those words. Nobody stood at a podium and announced, "We have arranged an interest-free loan for ourselves at Canada's expense." But strip away the language, follow the timing of the dollars, and that is a very large part of what actually happened. And this is the entire reason we read the fine print. Because the headline said victory, but the mechanics of the money told a much quieter and much more specific story. And that gap between the headline and the mechanics is exactly where fortunes are quietly won and quietly lost. So let us bring this all the way home and pull out the lessons that will actually matter to you long after the news cycle has forgotten this bridge. Lesson 1. A celebratory announcement is marketing. It is not information. When anyone, a president, a company, a salesman, stands in front of you and declares a huge victory, that is the exact moment you should slow down and ask to see the terms. The louder the celebration, the more carefully you should read. Lesson 2. In any deal, always ask 3 simple questions. Who actually paid? Who actually profits? And who actually controls it? In this story, Canada paid. The profits got split with a country that paid nothing, and control of half the upside vanished into a fund that nobody will fully explain. 3 questions, and the whole shape of the deal appears. Lesson 3, and maybe the most important of them all. This bridge is a precedent. The logic used here, leverage over fairness, size over contribution, control over ownership, does not stay on one river. It is a template that can be pointed at pipelines, at railroads, at energy grids, at ports, at any critical piece of infrastructure where one side holds the timing and the other side holds the bill. So let us recap the whole journey. Canada paid all $4.7 billion. Canada built it. The original deal was genuinely fair. Then a finished bridge was held closed as leverage. And out came a new deal, where the country that paid nothing walks away with half the future profits, and half of those profits disappear into a fund with no published rules. The headline said America won. The fine print said, read a little closer. Now I would genuinely love to hear from you. Of everything we uncovered in this story, which single detail surprised you the most? Was it that Canada paid for all of it? Was it the private bridge sitting right next door? Or was it that mysterious fund? Tell me down in the comments, because I read them, and honestly the best insights on this channel very often come from you. And if this is the kind of thinking you want more of, taking the story that everyone is celebrating and quietly reading the page they hoped you would skip, then subscribe to Money Decoded and turn on the bell so that the next breakdown finds you the very moment it goes live. Because remember, the headline is the marketing, but the fine print is always the truth. I will see you in the next one.